please. A very good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and anybody who may be following us online. I'm Councillor Ian Edwards, and I'm Chairman of the Major Applications Planning Subcommittee, HS2. Before we get into the business, the agenda, just a couple of our ordinary pre-meeting announcements. Fire alarms, we're not expecting one, so if it sounds, we will be evacuating. We'll be going out the way you came back in. We'll all be leaving with you, so don't worry, we'll show you the way out. If that door's blocked for whatever reason, there is another fire exit behind us. Mobile phones, just ask everybody to have their mobile phones, telephones turned off, please. Residents' feedback forms are available on the chairs for members of the public, and also followers on YouTube. There is a drop-down menu, I'm told, that enables you to provide your feedback comments. Okay. Very quickly about this meeting. The Major Planning Subcommittee is considering the applications under very specific criteria, and therefore these are not considered planning applications, and therefore there are no petitions, therefore there are no speaking rights. So although we're meeting in public, nobody has speaking rights from the members of the public. That is the situation. Number of people around the table, and I will explain who they are and their roles. The councillors who form the committee and make the decisions. On my far left-hand side, Councillor Duncan, Councillor Oswald. Now, on my far right-hand side, Councillor Sled, Councillor Chamdow, Councillor Yarrow, and Councillor Lavery. We're assisted by an officer team. On my far left-hand side, we have the Borough Solicitor tonight, Rajesh Halagai. Anisha Teji is Democratic Services, minutes of the meeting. James Rogers, Head of Planning, gives us planning advice. Ian Thine is our Sustainability Officer, will be presenting the application and will also be giving us some expert advice on the matters. Okay, very quickly we're going to rattle through the agenda. Apologies for absence, please.
No apologies.
Thank you. And colleagues, any additional declarations of interest and matters coming before the committee? No, thank you. Right, we have to sign and receive the minutes of the 23rd of November. If people can remember that, come back. Agreed? Thank you very much. Okay, no matters have been notified in advance or urgent, and everything is in part one, which means the meeting is held in public. As I say, there are no speaking rights. So we are on to agenda item 6, which is the, effectively, the Newt Pond in Harville Road. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. So the first of two applications tonight, or submissions should I say, under Schedule 17 of the High Speed Rail Act. The first relates to plans and specifications for an ecological mitigation scheme comprising earthworks, including one number mitigation pond, 2 hibernaculum and 1 reptile basking bank, together with permanent fencing and 1 field gate. So if we go to the slides. Site location. So plans are submitted with the planning application. These are what's up for approval. Not the greatest of site location plans that, but you'll see the site is just to the east of the Hoack Lake, Hillingdon Outdoor Activity Centre, west of Harville Road, and would be accessed round the back of the Hoack facility via an existing agricultural track. You can see on the site plan where HS2 is proposed to go, and an aerial shot of the site in question, and you can see the Hoack Lake there to the west of the site and north of Skip Lane. So the plans and specifications that are up for approval tonight include this one, showing the location of the pond and the basking areas, the reptile basking areas, and the hibernacular. And you'll see the details of the pond there. So it's 150 square metres. The hibernacular, a relatively small scale in relative to the pond, 6 metres by 5 metres, and the reptile basking bank is slightly bigger, 20 metres by 7.5 metres. So these are the plans and specifications up for approval. The submission also refers to the spreading of material across the rest of the site. However, this is not part of the plans and specifications being submitted for approval by HS2 Limited, although the council obviously has some concerns with that, as raised in the last committee with the last proposal, but that does not form part of what we're asking for approval for tonight. So the grounds for consideration for this, because it's a Schedule 17 submission under the HS2 Act, that the design or external appearance of the works ought to and can reasonably be modified to A, preserve the local environment or local amenity, B, to prevent or produce or reduce prejudicial effects on road safety or on the free flow of traffic in the local area, or C, to preserve a site of archaeological or historic interest or nature conservation value. And importantly for this application, if the development does not form part of a scheduled work, that the development ought to and could reasonably be carried out elsewhere within the development's permitted limits. So the council has considered the proposals, and officers have recommended 2 reasons for refusal. So reason 1, the design or external appearance of the works ought to and could reasonably be modified to preserve a site of archaeological or historic interest or nature conservation value, and that the development does not form part of a scheduled work within the meaning of Schedule 1 of the HS2 Act, and therefore development ought to and could reasonably be carried out elsewhere within the development's permitted limits. Both of these reasons for refusal are in the interest of preserving a site of archaeological priority and also a nature conservation value. So if I just come on to some of the justifications for that. So if you see on the map behind you, you can see 2 areas, not the greatest quality map, but the blue area is the site of importance for nature conservation. So this is the Mid-Colne Valley Regional Park, effectively. And this is a metropolitan site of importance for nature conservation, so one of the highest designations at a regional level before you get to statutory designations such as SSSIs at a national level. So it's a high quality site, and you can see the site there, and the round, the circle there represents the rough approximation of the pond going on the edge of the designation. The second designation of importance is the green area, and that's the archaeological priority zone. So there's the definition of that is there is an expectation that there would be archaeological finds within that area. So the basis for this is the starting point for the council is that this site is of a nature conservation value and is of archaeological interest, and therefore the default position should be on the applicant to demonstrate how these 2 factors have been preserved. So in terms of ecology, I'll start with that one first if I may. The reason for the ecology refusal, or recommended refusal, basically stems from the assertion from HS2 Limited that the site was recently ploughed. Initially they said last year, 2017, and then on further discussions advised that actually it was 2016, and they have communications to that effect with the landowner. However, they've never presented those communications to us, and in fact our records indicate that the last time it was ploughed, unfortunately can't see that overly clearly on this particular screen, but this image would show a ploughed field was in 2014, although this date is from 2013. The image from 2014 is not so clear, but it just gives you an illustration of what a ploughed field looks like. 2015, the site is now as we see it today. It's an ecological site, it's naturalised, and now forms a completely different role than the farming site. And 2016 again. And this was a site photo taken at the beginning of this year, showing the site to be predominantly covered with what is called common teasel and a variety of other nectar-rich plants, all of which have just naturalised over the time of fallow agricultural practices, and consequently now represents a site of what we would consider to be of ecological value, supporting the wider Mid-Colne Valley. So a site that needs to be taken seriously with regards to ecology. And there we can see another lovely photo. Unfortunately, the applicant has not presented any ecological assessments for this site, no surveys, and no justification for thought this would happen, councillor. So if I continue without that for the time being, and then maybe we can sort that out in due course. So the applicant hasn't provided any information regarding ecology, and consequently the default position for the council is that we need to preserve the site. The council received an updated memo in January 2018, which has been submitted and uploaded onto the website. A site visit had been carried out apparently at the end of last year, and now there was an acceptance that the site does have ecological value. The scheme has not changed though. Council is also concerned about locating a pond for the great crested newts that may impact on existing populations in 3 identified ponds by the applicant. They haven't located them on plan though, so remains a lack of information in relation to those other ponds. Part of the protocol for translocating newts is to ensure that the existing populations in existing ponds would not be imbalanced by the new arrivals. In that regard, the pond being located here may not be appropriate to translocate newts to in any event. All of which remains unknown because the applicant has failed to provide sufficient information. So from my council, in terms of weight, officers have placed a high degree of weight to the ecological value of the site as it currently stands. Officers have been unable to give weight to the justification for proposing a pond in this location. We don't know what harm the proposal would have, although it is likely that there would be a significant reduction in the ecological value of the site. And we don't know why this site is important to HS2 Limited because they have not provided the information. What we do know is that the site forms part of the permitted limits, and because this is not a scheduled work, the proposed ponds could go in any location within the permitted limits. We know that there are sites within the borough that have recent agricultural activity and therefore would have a lower ecological value. We know that there are sites in the borough that do not form part of a wider ecological site of nature conservation, and we also know that there are sites available that are not in archaeological priority zones. So it's officers' opinion that the site is a speculative proposal in the event that they perhaps find newts, but that would remove an existing natural feature in this area. I do understand that it's a relatively minor proposal given the HS2 Act, given the HS2 proposals, but Parliament, through the Act, have given limited material considerations for these submissions, but has tasked councils with preserving archaeological and nature conservation sites. This should trigger a degree of quality of information that enables us to do that, and in this instance is lacking. So in regards to archaeology, very similar kind of manner. Essentially it comes down to process. At the minute there is no dispute between the council and the applicant as to whether or not the site is in an archaeological priority zone. It is accepted that there is likely, or that there could be archaeological finds there, and that further information is needed. Essentially the argument boils down to the applicant wishing to do this at a later date. So we want our approval, and then we will cover the issues through environmental minimum requirements set out in the Act. However, that obviously conflicts with the requirements of the Act, which allows us to protect and preserve a site of archaeological importance at this stage. So there's a conflict there between the approach of HS2 and the supporting information and the environmental minimum requirements and what the Act requires councils to do. So based on the precautionary approach, the officer recommendation is to consider that the site would not preserve archaeological features and ultimately would have a detrimental impact. So the recommendation is for 2 reasons for refusal. We believe that the plans could be modified or altered to preserve a site of archaeological feature or ecological features, or ultimately be moved to a site that we know would have less value. So that's the officer recommendations. Councillor.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Colleagues, I should put on record that over the weekend I received a letter from solicitors instructed by HS2, 11 pages long legal argument as to why the officer's recommendation was wrong. It was a dense legal document, and therefore I took the view that best person to consider that would be our borough solicitor rather than sharing 11 pages of legal argument with committee members. Suffice it to say that there is a difference of opinion of whether or not the council has the power at this stage to be refusing on the grounds that has been set out in the presentation. It is not disputed that the council under section 17 do consider and give approval or refusal on the grounds of preservation of site of archaeological or historic interest or nature conservation value. And it's very clear that this ticks both boxes, archaeological and nature conservation value. From my perspective, it is then very reasonable for the committee to take a view that they need more information to determine the extent of the risk in either of those areas. And therefore, the questions that have been asked are right and proper. The absence of information, for me, makes it difficult to form a view that this should be permitted because I don't understand the risks here. And therefore, there is something, for me, about the completeness of the information provided to enable the council to take this view. The legal argument from the other side is that don't worry about that, it'll all come good in the wash because there are other processes that mean that we will consider these in due course. I will take guidance here from the Borough Solicitor now on whether or not the presentation provided by Ian and my interpretation and words amount to grounds for refusal. Thank you.
Okay, good evening, and thank you very much, Chairman. I spent many happy hours today reading this 11-page letter from this firm of solicitors, and as you would expect, they thought of every possible argument in the world as to why this application should be allowed. And to try and summarise it, what they are essentially saying is that the application should be approved because there are a number of other processes and procedures which allow for a full archaeological and ecological evaluation to take place. And in particular, they are referring to the Heritage Memorandum, the Planning Memorandum, the Code of Construction Practice, the environmental minimum requirements. And what they're saying is that those all require High Speed 2 Limited to have all the correct processes in place before this application is actually implemented. And because the Act is very new, it's only 13 months old, there is an absence of precedent, an absence of case law. I tried to Google some of that today, couldn't find anything, so a lot rests on interpretation. And my interpretation is that it would set a dangerous precedent for this committee to consider incomplete applications. I mean, it would be perfectly open to High Speed 2 Limited to have carried out proper evaluations and then submitted their Schedule 17 submission. And indeed, in the letter from their solicitor, they said that if some way down the future they can't satisfy, for example, the archaeological requirements, then they can submit a fresh Schedule 17 application. And it's my view that the Act wasn't intended to allow for a succession of Schedule 17 applications. The onus, in my view, is on them, it's on High Speed 2 Limited to get it right first time and to present sufficient information before this committee to not only satisfy the statutory tests in Schedule 17 of the High Speed 2 Act, but also to have regard to the Wednesbury principles of decision making. That is to have enough information in front of members in order to allow them to make a lawfully based decision, and that is a fundamental principle of public law. Now, it's been made very clear in the letter from the solicitors that if they don't get their own way, they'll throw their toys out the pram and they will appeal to the Secretaries of State for Community and also the Secretary of State for Transport, which I find quite quirky because the Secretary of State for Transport actually promoted the bill in the first place. So you're asking somebody to adjudicate on the very law which they introduced. So all things said, I mean, it's my view that it would be a reasonable inference for this committee to draw that in the absence of sufficient information in front of them, that the design or external appearance of these works could be modified so as to preserve archaeological interests and also ecological interests as well. There is also a second ground of refusal in the report, which is independent of the first, and that says if the development does not form part of a scheduled work, that the development ought to and could reasonably be carried out elsewhere within the development's permitted limits. Now, you've heard from my colleague Ian Thine It's very clear that this is not a schedule work. Schedule works are set out in Schedule 1 of the High Speed 2 Act. Nowhere in the solicitor's letter do they try and argue that this is not a schedule work. And Ian has given evidence and has given a statement this evening that it's his view that these works could reasonably be carried out elsewhere within the development's permitted limits. And you have no other evidence to the contrary. So in my view, it would be reasonable for the committee to draw that inference. I'm not saying, I wish to make it clear that my interpretation may be wrong. It's one that I've adopted, and I think it's a common sense interpretation. Otherwise, you'd have to ask yourself, why have the High Speed 2 Act in the first place? Because all High Speed 2 Limited could do would make these applications, say it's all going to be all right on the day, we'll get things right in the future, job done. That's not the role of this planning authority. It's actually to determine these Schedule 17 applications on their own merits. And for all those reasons, I agree with the analysis and the approach adopted by Mr. Thine.
Thank you. Can I bring in Councillor Oswald, then Councillor Lavery, then Councillor Duncan? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thanks for those comments, Raj. It does make things, I won't say easier, because, I mean, certain members sitting around this table, we sit on other planning committees, and we don't frighten easily when people try to threaten us, because I think that's what that is, and I don't like it, because all we can do is look at the report that's in front of us, the recommendations, and read through the report and see what we can find and make sure that it's robust enough to either be approved or refused. That's our job. What I've come across in here today is, apart from the recommendations, on page 26, on the boundary treatment, it says new fencing is proposed along the boundaries of the site. Limited details of the fencing type have been provided. Limited. Well, I want to know what the details are. I want to know what we're going to get. My colleague, Councillor Duncan, said at, I think it was the last meeting, that fencing is a hard boundary, and it is. And I know hedgerows take quite a while to grow, and it does say that a new hedgerow will be planted, but that will take quite a while. So if we're going to have fencing, if this is approved or whatever, then I want more details of that fencing, because I want to know what people are going to have to look at if they want to visit the site.
Can I just hold you on that point and just take some advice here from Ian Thine about whether or not the design of a fence is a matter that can be considered under Schedule 17?
Thank you, Councillor. I take the point. The design of the fence is extremely important. However, Schedule 17 is very limiting on what we can and cannot prove. Schedule 17 of the Act allows us to comment on the route of the fence, but not the design of the fence. This is one of the quirks of the Act, which we're not obviously happy with, but it's now for us to work with if it were to be approved, it work with the applicant to make sure that we get a fence that is of reasonable nature.
Okay, so if we could just limit our discussion then upon the designs, because that, unfortunately, and it's difficult for our residents to understand, that individually as councillors we may have far greater concern, but as a planning committee here, we can only consider those issues that the law allows us to, and Schedule 17 is quite specific. Yeah,
thank you, Chairman. No, well, I was just going to go on to say that I wouldn't want to see a chicken wire fence or something like that. I'd want to see something made of wood so that it fits in with the environment, if that's going to be the case. And that's basically it. And could I just finish, Chairman, by saying that in the past, at different committees, we've rejected applications that don't give us enough detail. We've done that, and I don't think we've got it.
Thank you very much. Councillor Lavery.
Accepting that the HS2 Act and Schedule 17 severely constrains the matters that we can consider and the matters that we would all, I'm sure, like to consider and would normally consider. We do have before us a report which, in the opinion of the officer and the borough solicitor, gives us grounds to refuse it. There is clearly going to be a further adjudication on the matter, i.e. that the Secretary of State, probably delegated to the Planning Inspectorate, is ultimately going to rule as to whether HS2 have got the correct interpretation of the Act or whether we are. But we have a case that has been put very clearly that these works could be modified to preserve the sites we haven't got enough information to know whether the impact on sites of archaeological or historic interest, and that actually, essentially, they could be put somewhere else. They're not so specific that they couldn't go somewhere else. And again, the evidence isn't there. So I think the application does lack evidence. Obviously, the HS2 version of the story is, well, do it now and we'll kind of sort the other bits out somewhere down the track. And I accept that there is an element of the legislation that gives them that right. They don't appear to have it in these circumstances, and therefore I would have no problem at all in proposing that the officer's recommendation be accepted to refuse this application.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Duncan.
Thank you, Chair. I do think that although we're very constrained by this Act and we're all in a new situation as planning committee members, so also are HS2, because so much is prescribed by the Act very clearly. And this is one area where the local authority does have the freedom to act, and to act to protect its sites of archaeological or historic interest or nature conservation value. In this case, both those requirements are affected in this application, and so I have no hesitation in seconding my colleague's proposal that we refuse this.
Thank you very much, colleagues. It has been formally proposed and seconded. Councillor Yarrow, do you have any issues?
I don't have any issues at all. I'd just like to say that I think that it indicates in a way that we're being tested, because this was withdrawn before, and they have chosen not to make any amendments to it or to recreate any other further conditions or whatever you want to call it in order to try and get it through. So they've just plopped the same document down and said, get on with it. Well, we're going to get on with it, and I agree with with what all my colleagues have said, and it should be rejected.
Okay, so let's take a show of hands, please, on that one. This is going with the officer's recommendation of refusal. That's unanimous, and that application is refused. So we now move on to, and we will just reboot the technology to be able to go to agenda item 7, the compounds at Harville Road. So once the slides are up, Ian, if we just hang on for a second, thank you. I mean, if you wish to start your verbal presentation now and then refer to slides in due course, then that might be helpful to us.
Thank you again, Councillor. Yes, it's hopefully fairly more straightforward, this one. So the proposal is for the submission of a lorry route approval. This means that the council is being asked to consider a route for LGVs, but in this instance large goods vehicles as defined by the Act, not to be confused at a later date with other abbreviations, HGVs and LGVs, light good vehicles. So we're talking about large good vehicles, LGVs, and it's for the approval of a route that will be subjected to more than 24 movements a day. So that's 12 in, 12 out to a specific compound. The routes are on the screen behind you. There are 2 compounds just off Harville Road, south of the Chiltern Lines, north of the Chiltern Lines. Many people will be familiar with these now. These compounds are in existence, and up until this moment in time, they've serviced these compounds without the need for more than 24 lorry routes a day. However, as set out in their local transport traffic management plan, that actually doesn't form part of this submission but has informed officer opinion. You'll see in the second one there, between mid-March 2018 to mid-April 2018, the estimated LGV movements, large good vehicles, will be up to 40 per day during the construction of the diaphragm wall shaft of a gas pipeline. So this is a relatively short period of time, small window of opportunity for them, and they are exceeding the 24 movements a day, so have asked for our approval. As I said, it has been accompanied by this local traffic management plan, and I can confirm that the traffic management plan is acceptable to officers in our highways department. So you'll see the 2 compounds there. A large percentage of the vehicles will actually be coming from Skip Lane, the area circled. So in fact we'll have minimal interaction with Harville Road, serving the 2 compounds, and many of the movements required for the lorry route approval actually are existing because of the movements between compound 1 and compound 2 as they move a pipeline underneath the Chiltern line. So the officer recommendation is for approval, subject to an informative that it has to happen in accordance with the traffic management plan, and therefore, Councillor, I've got no further issues, no further comments to make on this.
Okay, thank you very much. Colleagues, this is a relatively straightforward matter, and just a general comment that ordinarily when we consider planning applications, and I again emphasise this isn't a planning application with regards to the consideration that we can take, what is presently an informative would be something we'd be seeking to be a condition. However, because it's a Schedule 17 application, and it's very clear that the statutory guidance prevents us from imposing conditions that are conflict with or are contained with the environmental minimum requirements, and that includes the traffic management plan, we are not allowed to put this as a condition. Therefore, the next step is for us to put it as an informative, such that if they breach the informative, they are then breaching the environmental minimum requirements, and action can be taken that way. So that is a bit of a long-winded explanation to members of the public who may be following us of why this is an informative and not a condition. It was one of my questions of officers. So I open this now to colleagues for comment or taking forward. Thank you. Councillor Duncan.
Thank you, Chair. I noticed it said on the plans it's just for 5 days, and they hope to do this during the Easter holiday period so that it will not affect people trying to get children to school. But in the informative, it just refers to the traffic management plan. So does that include that it be done during Easter holidays, or don't we have that freedom to put that in?
Thank you, Councillor. So what HS2 Limited have come for our approval today, in effect, is to use the road for more than 24 lorries. So they're not stating a specific figure. So in future submissions, when we get to the more meaty proposals, there will be numbers as high as 400, 500 lorry movements a day mentioned in the supporting traffic management plan. However, the approval will still be for just more than 24. So in that regard, all the details and details that you mentioned about Easter working are contained in the traffic management plan. So it's not appropriate for us to specify that in the informative as such. It links to the traffic management plan, and the traffic management plan is very important and needs to inform those decisions, particularly on the more meaty applications in the future.
Thank you. Councillor Lavery.
On the basis this appears straightforward, and if it goes to plan as it is supposed to, it should be for a relatively short period of time during a period when the roads should be a little bit quieter. I would support the officer recommendation.
Thank you very much. Councillor Duncan, you're seconding, and show of hands please on this one. That's everybody, that's one that's agreed. Thank you very much. That brings the meeting to a close. Thank you.